For people who lived in Europe, China was an unknown land. The long road that led to China, the Silk Road, led through mountains and along the edges of steep rocky cliffs. It wound through dry deserts where the only water to be found was in small pools and scattered oases. Merchants who set off down the Silk Road to buy spices and jewels in China might be lost in a sandstorm in summer or a snowstorm in winter. And China was so far away that it could take 5 years to travel down the Silk Road and return. But the merchants who did manage to travel the Silk Roads found wonderful things at its end: gold, cloves and ginger, jade, lacquer, rare and beautiful flowers, wine, sweet-smelling wood, rugs with rich complicated patterns, and the mysterious shining silk cloth that only the Chinese knew how to make. Europeans marveled over these treasures and hurried to buy them as soon as the caravans from China arrived. Kublai Khan knew that trade with Europe would make China even more prosperous, so he did his best to encourage traders and merchants to come to his cities. He turned his Mongol soldiers into road keepers and policemen and sent them out to guard the road and protect travelers against bandits. As the journeys grew safer, more and more merchants and adventurers traveled along the Silk Road to see the marvels of China. One of these adventurers was named Marco Polo. Marco Polo was the son of an Italian merchant named Niccolo. Before Marco was born, Niccolo left on a journey to China. He didn't come back until Marco was 15 years old. When he did return, he told his son, "It took me 3 years to travel to the palace of the great Khan. When I arrived, the Khan made me welcome and gave me a position as his messenger. All this time I have been working for the Emperor of China. He sent me back home to ask the Pope for 100 wise men who could explain Christianity. And he also wants me to bring back some holy oil from Rome. You're a strong boy. You're growing up to be a man. You can travel with me to China." So Marco and his father and the wise men and the holy oil started back for the Emperor of China. But the journey was long and tedious, and many of the wise men turned back. The journey took 4 years. Marco and his father were attacked by bandits. They had to take a detour to avoid a war in one of the countries they passed through. Marco became ill and had to rest for a whole year. But finally, Marco and his father arrived in the city of Beijing, and there they met the Emperor Kublai Khan. Later, when Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295, Venice was at war with the Republic of Genoa. Polo was caught and held captive by the Genoans in a skirmish in 1296. He spent several months in prison, during which he dictated a detailed account of his travels to a fellow inmate. His fellow inmate incorporated tales of his own as well as other collected anecdotes and current affairs from China. The book soon spread through Europe in manuscript form and became known as The Travels of Marco Polo, or the Italian title Il Milione, literally the million, a nickname he was given by Venetians for his description of the vast wealth of Kublai Khan's court. For many years, Marco Polo's book was the only way for people in the West to find out what China was like. In this book, Marco Polo described the marble palace of the Khan. The palace stood in a huge walled garden where wild animals roamed the ground. A man-made mountain rose up in the garden's center, with beautiful trees from every part of the world planted all over it. A lake filled with fish lay at the foot of the mountain, and a small palace for the Khan to relax in was built at its top. Inside the palace, carvings of dragons and colorful paintings of battle scenes covered the walls. Marco Polo was led to a dining hall where 6,000 people could eat. In his book, he wrote, "It is all painted in gold, with many histories and representations of beasts and birds, of knights and dames, and many marvelous things. All over its walls and all over the ceiling you see nothing but paintings in gold." Here the great feasts of the Khan were held, and Marco Polo tasted his very first ice cream. Marco Polo was amazed by the beautiful clothes that the Chinese people wore, by the abundance of fresh meat and vegetables in the Chinese markets, and by the size of the fruit. "Certain pears of enormous size," he wrote, "weigh as much as 10 pounds each." And he was astounded to see fires made of black rocks that burned. Marco Polo had never seen coal before. Marco and his father stayed in China for almost 20 years. Marco traveled all around China, seeing its great cities with their beautiful buildings and its tiny villages filled with peasants and farmers. Eventually, Kublai Khan put Marco Polo in charge of governing different cities in his empire. He sometimes asked Marco to judge between Chinese officials who were arguing with each other. And once he even asked Marco to find out whether his soldiers were plotting against him. When Marco and his father finally returned home, the relatives refused to let them in. Marco was now a man of 40, and Niccolo had a white beard, and they were wearing ragged, dirty clothes. "You aren't Marco and Niccolo," their relatives scoffed. "They've been dead for years. You're just beggars." So as proof, Marco and Niccolo ripped open the seams of their coats. Jewels tumbled out, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. The two men had worn their oldest clothes and had sewn their jewels into the seams so that robbers would not attack them. Finally, their relatives believed them and let them in. Marco and Niccolo had finally returned from China.